The following story will show how the events described in Part 1 could be avoided. If you have not already listened to Part 1, please listen to that first. Let's say there is a perfect family living the American dream. Dad is an electrical engineer with a six-figure salary. Mom is a nursing assistant, and they have 3 kids. 2 girls, 15 and 12, and a boy, 7. They have a cat named Fluffy and a dog named Betsy. They also live in a nice home in a nice neighborhood. They have health insurance and 2 pensions. They also own a BMW, a minivan, a motorcycle, and a small powerboat. 3 months earlier. Dad is just your average guy, hardworking, who cares about his family, community, and church. He's not one of those crazy conspiracy guys, but he knows enough not to ever trust a politician, and he takes what he sees on the news with a big grain of salt. He's not one of those wacky apocalypse prepper guys, but he keeps an emergency kit in the car, and he's pretty handy around the house. Each night, the nightly news tells him the economy is solid, lots of jobs, and the stock market is up. But driving into work each day for the past few months, Dad noticed that there were more and more empty office spaces, that there are even a couple of prime retail locations that have closed down. One time, he went off his regular route and drove past a homeless camp set up under one of the overpasses. If the economy is doing so well, why are businesses still closing down? And if there are so many jobs, why are there whole families living in the streets? Dad felt uneasy, and it reminded him of a conversation he had as a young man with his grandpa, who was just a boy during the Great Depression. Grandpa told him stories of what life was like then, how they were always cold and hungry. Granddad told him that they should always have 3 months' worth of food stored away. 6 months would be even better. That was a long time ago, and Dad never thought much about it since, but he did know that he would never want his family to suffer like Grandpa did. That weekend, Dad sat at the computer and did a lot of research. Mom wanted to know why Dad was so serious and what he was researching, but Dad told her, "I'll tell you everything once I've got this figured out." On Sunday night, Dad called Mom aside and told her of his plan. Mom didn't like it and thought Dad had gone off his rocker. But Dad explained it was just like an insurance policy, something to keep the family safe. And besides, if nothing happened, there is still value they could reclaim from their efforts. Dad reminded Mom of the stories Grandpa used to tell, and she reluctantly agreed to go along with his plans. Then Dad called the kids in and told them that for the next 3 months, all their classes will be on hold, that they will be enrolled in special classes that Dad had chosen for them. And those new smartphones everybody wants for Christmas? Not happening this year. They'll just have to use their old phones for a while longer. The kids were not happy about the news, but Dad understood that to be a good father, you sometimes need to be a good general. A general that has to make hard decisions to keep his troops safe. Instead of buying $3,000 worth of smartphones, Dad took $1,000 and bought 2 handheld shortwave radios and a 100-watt base station. Mom and Dad would each keep one of the portable radios in the car, and the base station would be set up in the study. If ever the phones went out, the family would still be able to talk to each other if they were separated, and they could also tune in and get news from around the world. Then he used the rest of the money to buy a 9mm pistol and a 12-gauge shotgun for himself. 2 .380 pistols, one for Mom and one for eldest daughter, a .22 caliber semi-auto rifle for middle daughter, and finally a .22 caliber Browning pistol for youngest son. Dad knew that police don't actually prevent crime. They only arrive to tag the bodies, and he was going to make damn sure that his family could protect themselves whether or not police are still in service. Using the money saved from canceling everyone's lessons and memberships, Dad enrolled the whole family in weekend courses for the next 3 months. First, everyone took an emergency first aid and CPR course. The next 2 weeks were spent taking a ham radio course. Everyone would need to know how to operate the radios. Then, 5 weekends at the shooting range, so that everyone, even youngest son, would know how to use every weapon they had, and everyone would need to pass the firearms safety course. Then, the final 6 weeks would be spent taking self-defense lessons and a weekly trip to the gun range. Meanwhile, Mom had her duties too. First, she put together an extensive first aid kit. She also used her friendship with one of the doctors at the hospital to get prescriptions for penicillin, amoxicillin, and tetracycline that she filled and refilled and stored at home. Another part of Dad's plan was to make friends and build community. One thing Grandpa told him was that their family survived the Great Depression in part to great-granddad's friendship with the local farmers. Once a week he would go out to the country where he could trade for some potatoes, fresh eggs, and once a month a chicken or maybe some sausage. So on Sundays, Mom went to the farmer's market. Mom would bake some cookies and put 6 in small bags, and when she bought some produce or meat from any of the vendors, she would thank them and give them a little bag of cookies. Soon she became known as the Cookie Lady, and Mom got to know several of the local farmers and where their farms were. Since Mom was making weekly trips to the market anyways, she went to one of the seniors' buildings and offered to buy and deliver a weekly order for those that can no longer make it to the farmer's market. In this way, Mom could buy many items at a bulk discount, saving on her grocery bill, which would help because the food prices were rising every month. Mom also went to the nursery and bought some heirloom seeds for a full vegetable garden, enough for 3 seasons. She also picked up some topsoil and some planters. Over the next 3 months, Dad did what he could to build a network. He attended the Lions Club and Rotarian meetings, where he asked to speak for a few minutes. Dad proposed the idea of forming a volunteer citizen search and rescue team. Their town was subject to floods, forest fires, and severe winter storms, and often the local emergency services were quickly overwhelmed. A volunteer group could offer additional life-saving services in the event of a natural disaster. They would register as a nonprofit and would seek donations to pay for training and equipment. Once a month, they would meet at one of the library meeting rooms, where they would bring in different instructors in first aid, CPR, and search and rescue. Then they bought bright red jackets with Volunteer Search and Rescue emblazoned on the back and Red Cross and team patches on the front. Then each member would be outfitted with radios, flashlights, medical kits, ropes, and other equipment. Volunteer disaster response groups usually work in coordination with local police and fire departments, so this would give Dad an opportunity to make contacts with local law enforcement and first responders. In this way, Dad was able to assemble, equip, and train a small group of rugged men and women that could work together as a team. During peacetime, they would provide life-saving services to their community. However, during war and civil unrest, such groups often morph into paramilitary and guerrilla units. In addition, in case of martial law, where travel is restricted, a small group outfitted and identified as a rescue team would have a much better chance of getting through the police checkpoints. Dad also called his uncle that lived alone in a large house with a few acres out in the country. The next weekend he drove out there with a bottle of Crown Royal, a box of dog treats for Uncle's dog Barney, and a big tray of lasagna Mom had cooked. Dad told Uncle about his concerns and his contingency plans. Uncle told him that Dad and his family are welcome anytime, no need to call ahead. Finally, Dad did something he didn't want to do. Everyone had to sacrifice something, and so Dad sold his boat. He loved that boat, but truth be told, he had not taken it out in almost 6 years. With the money, he first bought a year's supply of food, including cat and dog food for Fluffy and Betsy. Then he had burglar bars installed on all the first-floor windows and doors. He also bought a diesel generator and built a soundproof plywood box in the garage to store it in. He bought some items Mom didn't understand, like a dozen sheets of plywood, lumber, chicken wire, some cans of spray paint, 20 feet of copper tubing, connectors and valves, and a 5-gallon pressure cooker. With the money he had left, he bought a few dozen ounces of silver bullion and an ounce of gold in 5-gram bars. Week 1. At dinner one night, Mom tells Dad that a quarter of the stores in the mall have shut down and that food prices have nearly doubled. Dad had some worrying news too. The company he works for is planning to lay off 20% of the workforce. The next day, Dad gets to the utility bill and his jaw drops when he sees the electrical bill has tripled. On the way to work the next morning, he stops at the gas station to fill up and finds out that the cost of gas has tripled as well. Dad called a family meeting and told everyone that, while he had hoped everyone could resume their extracurricular activities by now, the economy was not getting better, and they will have to postpone all lessons and memberships until further notice. To save on the electric and gas bill, they need to keep most of the lights turned off and the heat turned down. Everyone will need to wear a sweater in the house. Also, Mom and Dad will have to carpool to save on gas. That weekend, Dad sells the BMW and buys a 10-year-old compact 4-cylinder rice burner. His co-workers and neighbors snickered and rolled their eyes when they saw Dad driving an old beater. But Dad had his reasons. In addition to saving on gas, this car won't attract the kind of attention the BMW did, and thus is less likely to be stolen or carjacked. Week 2. The next week, Mom goes to buy groceries, but discovers that the farmer's market has closed. She drives through town looking for a grocery store that's still in business, passing storefront after storefront that has been closed down. She finally finds a store open and goes inside. Half the shelves are empty, and the bread now goes for $25 per loaf and milk at $50 a quart. Mom decides she's not going to pay those prices. They will just have to draw on their emergency supplies until prices come down. Mom called a couple of the farmers she befriended at the farmer's market and asked if they had any food to sell. They said yes, but they could not take cash. Mom offered to pay them with half-ounce silver rounds, and they agreed. Mom and Dad drove out to the country and came back with potatoes, corn, a pork hind, and 2 chickens and a rooster so that they could have fresh eggs. On the way back, they drive past the seniors' building to tell them the bad news about the market closing down. But the building was empty and the doors chained. Where were all the seniors, Mom wondered. She would never have an answer. Week 3. That Monday, Mom finds out she has been let go from the hospital where she worked. Dad said not to worry because this way the kids can stay home from school and Mom can homeschool. The streets were getting dangerous and Dad was worried about the kids going to school anyways. The next day, Dad arrives at work to find his co-workers gathered outside the front door that has been locked up with a sign in the window that simply said, "Out of business." That night, there was the sound of breaking glass and yelling coming from down the street. The sky in the distance lit up from the fires started in some of the abandoned houses. There were no longer any emergency sirens. The police, ambulance, and fire departments were not responding to 911 calls. Dad calls the family together and instructs them that from now on, no one goes anywhere alone, that they should always travel in twos, and that everyone always carry a concealed pistol. The next morning, Dad gets some tools and lumber from the garage and boards up all the ground floor windows from the inside with plywood he had bought. He cuts a small slit in each sheet to act as a gun port. Dad then gets on the telephone and calls all his search and rescue team members. He suggests everyone check in once a day to make sure everyone is all right and to keep their radios on standby to receive emergency calls. That night, there was a banging on the front door. It's their neighbor, Bob, from 3 doors down. He came to check in on the family and thanked Dad for his advice. Bob had bought some emergency food supplies, and that while the rest of the neighbors were going without food, Bob and his family are well fed and safe. The next day, there was a letter from the township announcing the property taxes had been quadrupled and made retroactive, and that they now owe $9,000 in back taxes. The electric bill had doubled again. Dad took some of his silver bullion down to City Hall, where a few ounces paid all the taxes. With 1,000% inflation, Dad's silver was now worth 1,000 times what he had paid. And since they didn't bankrupt themselves paying for groceries and fuel, Dad still had enough money to pay the electric and phone bills. Week 4. One night, middle daughter developed a chronic cough. Mom's nursing experience told her that she was suffering from a respiratory bacterial infection. They would need to take her to the hospital to get her checked out. Thank God they still had health insurance. But when they arrived at the hospital, the doors were locked, and a large sign said that they had no medications or supplies left and could not accept any more patients. When they got home, Mom, knowing the family's medical history, knew it was safe to give middle daughter a course of amoxicillin. By the end of the week, she had completely recovered, and Mom thanked God that they had stocked up on medications. Dad then revealed the purpose of the copper tubing and pressure cooker. They were the components to a still. Mom was able to get 100 pounds of half-rotted potatoes from one of the farmers, and she began distilling spirits. They could produce about 5 quarts a week that they could use to barter with. All the liquor stores had been robbed and looted, and spirits were in big demand. The next day, eldest daughter said they were lucky the hospital was closed because there was a virulent strain of influenza with a 30% mortality rate, and it hit all the hospitals first. Week 5. A radio call came in from Tim, who had joined Dad's search and rescue team. He said there were 3 cars parked out front of his house with men with guns. Dad told eldest daughter to call the team and tell them they were code red at Tim's. Dad grabbed his shotgun and his pistol and rode his motorcycle to Tim's house. When he arrived, there were already 4 of the other team members there, each armed. Using their radios, they coordinated a strategy. On his signal, Dad would come up from behind the looters. 4 would come in on their flank, and Tim would come out the front door. When the gang saw Tim coming out with his rifle, they swung their guns in his direction. But before they could fire a shot, the 4 team members flanking them opened fire. Tim opened fire from the front, and Dad opened fire from their rear. The gang was caught in a crossfire, and in a panic, scrambled to their cars and drove off. After that incident, Dad suggested that the families in his team double up for protection. Bob and his wife and 2 boys would move in with Dad's family. With 4 adults in one house, they could take turns during the night to keep watch. Tim and the other team members agreed. Having 2 families in one house improved security and helped with the logistics. The next night, Tim's house was burned down. But Tim, his family, and all his supplies had already moved in with another teammate a mile away. Week 6. Eldest daughter took a keen interest in the ham radio and would monitor various frequencies for hours. She scanned for news reports and chatter from all over the world, and each day after dinner, she would tell the family what was going on in what everyone called the nightly news. The news was grim. Martial law was declared throughout the country. California went bankrupt, and arsonists set fire everywhere. Without money, there were no firefighters to respond, and half of California was on fire, with millions of homes and businesses destroyed. Every large city across the country had whole neighborhoods burned down. The influenza virus had spread across the globe, and the death toll was in the millions. Europe was even worse. There were widespread food riots in China. Similar events were occurring the world over. To keep up morale, Mom and Bob's wife organized nightly activities. There was art class, game night, story night, and on Saturday, music night. A few days later, a radio call came from one of the police officers Dad had met during his training with the search and rescue team. Officer Friendly told Dad that the National Guard is scheduled to arrive in town in 2 days, but they were not there to help. There was an order issued under martial law making it illegal to hoard food. They were going to do a house-to-house search to confiscate any firearms and food. Dad radioed all his team members to warn them to hide their food and firearms. Then Dad threw some furniture, garbage, and clothes in the front yard. He then broke all the windows and used the spray cans to spray graffiti and gang tags all over the house. He then spray painted the universal symbol used by urban search and rescue teams to mark the front of the house. The symbol stated that the house had been searched and 3 bodies recovered. With luck, the soldiers would deduce that the house had been looted by gangs, the inhabitants murdered, and a search and rescue team had come around to remove the bodies. Then Dad hid 90% of the food and all the firearms in a hidden space between one of the walls. He then took 10% of his food supplies and hid them in a box in the closet. He also retrieved his great-grandfather's .45 caliber pistol and kept it on him. Dad's plan was that if they were to be searched, he could give up the old pistol and the month's supply of food, and hopefully that would placate the soldiers. Over the next few days, eldest daughter monitored the ham radio and listened in on the military chatter. An army truck rolled past the house twice, but they didn't stop. Half the town had been looted already, and for the soldiers charged with searching for food and guns, going into a house that looked like it had already been looted was just a waste of time. Week 8. Eldest daughter received another radio call from Officer Friendly. He warned Dad that the National Guard and UN troops were going to make another, more thorough sweep of the town. But this time, they were rounding up people to be relocated to a FEMA camp. Whatever you do, don't let them take you to a FEMA camp, he warned Dad. Dad couldn't risk staying in town any longer. They would have to go to Uncle's country house. Dad called an emergency meeting to discuss the idea of evacuating to the country with his team. 3 other team members had cottages and family living in the country where they could go. Tim and Bob's family will go with Dad. There were still military roadblocks on every major road out of the town, but Dad knew that there was a paved bicycle trail that ran along the river and ended up on the outskirts of town. From there, they could take the back roads to Uncle's house and bypass the roadblocks. Dad, Bob, and Tim loaded up their vans, trucks, and cars, taped over their brake lights, and in a convoy of 8 vehicles, they left at 3 a.m. and drove along the bicycle trail with their lights off, staying in touch with their radios. Dad rode a quarter mile ahead on his motorcycle to scout for possible trouble. By dawn, they were in the countryside, and 3 hours later, they were at Uncle's house. Uncle was happy to share his home, since living alone and only for yourself becomes tedious, and that the greatest joy truly lies in helping others. They all still had almost a year's supply of food, and all the generators, radios, firearms, and chickens. They were able to supplement their food by planting a large garden. They also had eggs from the chickens, and there was a stream and a lake nearby that provided fish, and Dad was able to hunt ducks and geese. Every week, Mom and Dad, wearing their search and rescue jackets and carrying a couple of quarts of Mom's moonshine, would go with Uncle and walk to one of the nearby farms to see if people still lived there. Several were abandoned. Either the owners never came back, or they went to the city to look for food. Most small farms were not being farmed and hadn't been for many years, and so when the local town grocery store closed down, many people in the rural communities were forced into the cities. They met 5 other families within a 10-mile radius who maintained their properties as small hobby farms and didn't have to go to the city for food. Mom would give them the moonshine as a welcome gift, and Dad and Uncle would explain that they were looking to build a community, that Dad and Mom were trained in search and rescue and medical care, and if anyone in their home was sick or injured, Mom and Dad would come to provide what care they could. They also shared the latest news from around the world that Big Sister provided, and they proposed the idea of bartering among the families. After a year, Dad's group was almost completely self-sufficient and still had 7 months' supply of emergency food left for everyone. Fluffy was quite happy on the farm and tolerated Bob's cat Shadow. Betsy the dog found 2 new friends in Tim's dog Thor and Uncle's old dog Barney. Mom and the other wives and daughters decided they needed to have a celebration, and so they planned a giant potluck dinner and invited all the 5 families to attend. Mom supplied the moonshine and wine she had been brewing, and Dad powered up the generator and hung Christmas lights along the trees and brought out Uncle's stereo, and they danced to classic rock and country. Then everyone gathered around the bonfire and told stories of what happened in the past year. The event was such a success that they all agreed to do it again every 3 months on the solstices and equinoxes. 3 years later, one day, Big Sister said there was exciting news. A provisional government had been established, and that a new currency in the form of a microchip implant was being issued. The power had been restored to a large part of the big city, and because so many had died during the Great Hunger, qualified people were urgently needed. Nursing assistants and electrical engineers were guaranteed a job in the city. That night, Mom, Dad, Uncle, and the kids sat around the campfire under the stars and discussed what they should do. Uncle said they were welcome to stay forever as far as he was concerned. Dad didn't like the idea of being microchipped just so he could work in the big city again. It sounded like another slave plantation scheme. Mom didn't look forward to going back to work in a big hospital, especially since there could be another outbreak of disease at any time, and she could risk infecting the entire family. Big Sister had become almost as popular as she was on Facebook through her radio interaction, and she had friends from all over the world. She was also fond of one of the neighbor's boys, and so she was in no hurry to return to the city. Middle Sister learned from Mom how to grow medicinal herbs and treat various illnesses, and she was becoming an expert healer. She also had a crush on the younger brother of Big Sis's boyfriend. The youngest son had taken to the country and become an excellent fisherman, hunter, and expert at gathering wild edibles, and loved nothing more than roaming the countryside with his shotgun and Betsy the dog trailing along. They then took a vote. All in favor of going back to the city, raise your hands. Well, it's unanimous, said Dad. We're not going back. Thank you for listening. This story is just a fiction for now. When our society collapses, as all eventually do, it could go down in numerous ways. This is not meant as an exact prediction. Likewise, the solutions I describe may or may not work, depending on your situation. My intent is twofold. First, to scare people that have become complacent into doing something. Part 1 is meant to show that no matter how well off you are, or how many toys you possess, if you did nothing to prepare, you will go down just as fast as everyone else. Part 2 is meant to illustrate how working together with a few people you can trust is a major factor in survival. But more than just survival, it is the key to the survival of our civilization. Whether the end comes through war, pandemic, or economic collapse, the cause will always be the result of the degenerate, psychotic psychopaths that rule our world. And look what they have done. We no longer have our own countries. We no longer have our own communities. We no longer have families. We don't even have our own gender anymore. Why? Because it makes us weak, vulnerable, and dependent on the state. They know that a family, united by the bonds of common values and a common purpose, could change an entire community. That a community, united by the bonds of common values and a common purpose, could change an entire country. That a nation, united by the bonds of common values and common purpose, could change the world. Please support my work by buying a copy of my book, The Art of Urban Survival. It contains most of the information you need to survive this scenario. And finally, if you can spare it, donate a couple of bucks to help me finish my next book that will fill in the crucial key to survival: how to form a community for mutual aid and support during the hard times. Thank you.